Injured German Shepherd refused to leave her dying pup. What a U.S. Marine did next shocked everyone. Misty cold drifts between Montana pines, silvering bark and swallowing distant sounds. A battered German Shepherd braces on 3 legs, fur matted, breath ragged, eyes burning gold. Her body shields a frail pup snagged inside a rusted fence, wire teeth biting skin with every twitch. Gray sky hangs low, wind carries sap, wet soil and iron. Somewhere farther uphill a crow cracks the silence. Caleb Holt pauses on a narrow trail, shoulders squared by years that never quite ended. Former Marine, 43, scarred, steadied by discipline, he catches a whisper soft as thread, one tiny whimper. He turns toward fog and shadow, palms open, voice barely above the needle's hush. Easy, he says, not a command, only an offering. The mother shifts, planting herself between him and that little body. Lips peel, a growl vibrates through ground and bone. She will not move. The pup shivers, ribs fluttering under wire like paper wings. Caleb studies angles, distances, risk. One wrong reach and pain wins. He lowers, removing gloves, surrendering warmth so fear sees skin instead of threat. I'm not here to take him, he whispers. Musk, blood, winter, memory, combat corridors, red dust. A friend fading while rotors thumped helplessly far away rush his senses. Not again, not this time. He scans for cutters, gauze, anything useful, finds nothing except grit and resolve. The fence leans, old and mean, ready to finish what neglect started. The dog's eyes plead without yielding. Night presses closer around them. Caleb steps into deeper mist, closer than safety suggests. Letting her scent him, letting her decide whether hope still lives in humans. A breath quivers, another whimper. He chooses. What he did next will shock you. Where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments and subscribe if you believe no one should be left behind. Caleb Holt woke before dawn as he always did, not because rest had satisfied him, but because dreams refused to. At 43, he lived alone on the north edge of Bozeman in a small cabin he kept squared away the way he once kept his rack and rifle. His hair showed gray streaks at his temples. A shrapnel scar ran a pale seam down his right calf, the souvenir that moderated his stride. The leg did not dictate his days, yet it shaped them, and he respected that fact the way a mountain man respects weather. He laced boots, checked pockets by touch, and stepped into air that tasted like cold water. Steel-gray clouds pressed low over the valley and made the town look tin. Wet leaves clung to the path. A crow offered a dry remark and stopped as if it disliked being heard. The air smelled of resin and damp earth. He locked the door out of habit and headed toward the ridge trail behind his property, choosing the route that kept his thoughts steady now. Walking the woods had become his way to sort memory from reflex. A snapped twig meant deer. A gust across the canopy meant weather. Smoke curling from a rancher's pile was only smoke, not the start of flares. He paced himself, counting 4-beat cycles until rhythm folded discomfort into the background. Here he could reduce life to what was in front of him: slope, footing, breath, and the discipline of attention. Bozeman lay a few miles south, with coffee counters and campus chatter. Up here the foothills held a different register. Lodgepole, 4, and pockets of aspen stood in damp ranks. Under it a half-forgotten fence wandered between alders, leaning and orange with neglect. He had noticed the line years earlier and treated it like a boundary inside his head. He paused at a saddle, drank, and felt warmth settle. Water argued softly with stones below. The crow called again, farther and fainter. For a moment the world aligned into ordinary miles, chores, a book by the stove. A thread of sound snagged that picture. Small and shy it rose from downslope, where the fence curled like a tired spine. Not a bark, not quite a cry, more a whimper worn thin against the quiet. The base of his skull lifted as if a perimeter shifted. Combat had trained that reflex. Trying to be decent had kept it on. He let his breath out, turned his head without moving his boots, then angled downhill with care that read as neutrality rather than pursuit. Brush thickened. Wet needles tried to skate on his foot. Another whimper came, shorter, taxed for trying. He crouched beside a tangle of chokecherry, touched one branch with 2 fingers, and finally saw what the sound had tried to protect. A German shepherd stood tense in the gap where 2 strands of wire had pulled apart and twisted back into a jagged mouth. Black and tan fur was matted with burrs and mud. One hind leg was bloodied along the hock. She faced him squarely, chest forward, ears pinned, amber eyes hard with promise. Behind her, pressed under the lowest wire as if the ground itself tried to keep him, lay a tiny pup. Damp coat clung to fragile ribs. Each breath arrived shallow, then paused as if deciding whether to continue. The mother's stance wrote its own warning across the clearing. Come closer and answer for it. Caleb lowered until his weight rested through his heels and let his hands hang open. Silence works better than speeches when fear stands near, so he gave it the first turn. The mother's lips edged back. A growl began low enough to register as vibration more than He measured distance and angle as if assessing a field of fire, not because he would fight but because awareness might keep everyone safe. The wire's barbs had caught a small paw where two twists met. One wrong tug would tear skin. One flinch would escalate a bad equation. He inventoried pocket. No cutters, no bandage besides a clean handkerchief. Gloves, yes. But leather often reads as a threat to an animal already bruised by collars and rough hands, so he kept them out of sight. He let his breathing slow until a long exhale lowered the edges of his presence. Easy, he said, the word almost a hum. The dog answered with a steady growl that carried more exhaustion than hatred. She refused to yield even an inch. Autumn worked its quiet on the margins. Mist slid between trunks and smudged outline. The crow went silent, unwilling to comment on a balance this precise. Caleb shifted his weight a fraction, and felt the scar tug like a reminder. A night years earlier surfaced, a private across his back while a helicopter hunted a landing zone. The memory came to say lives can be held by a thread. He studied the pup again. The small mouth opened for a stingy sip of air, then closed. Cold would win if time stretched. He shrugged out of his jacket and eased it toward the fence, placing it where warmth would be ready the instant he cleared the wire. The mother's eyes flicked to the fabric, then returned to his fingers. Her refusal to move felt absolute, yet pleading lived behind that stance as surely as a warning. He considered calling for help and dismissed it. Signal lived on the He could climb, call a clinic and try to guide a responder here. 10 minutes out, 10 back, and that plan assumed footing he could not promise. Meanwhile, the pup's breath would keep shrinking, and the mother would bleed into the cold ground. Speed mattered, but not more than He had seen what happens when force answers fear. It leaves everyone poorer. Names would arrive later, after warmth and food. For now there were only roles. The mother stood guard. The little life held on. A man with a scarred leg accepted the task that the morning had handed him. He spoke again, not to command but to align. I'm here, he whispered, voice even, hands still. He told the dog what he intended in plain terms. The growl dipped. Not consent, not tolerance, only the smallest acknowledgement that he meant no immediate harm. Wind slid colder down the slope. Steel-gray sky pressed closer to the tree line until the forest seemed ready to fold into metal. A droplet gathered on the wire, fattened, and fell on the pup's nose. The little body twitched, then went limp again. Urgency vaulted from idea to imperative. He inched a knee, set his palm in the needles, and edged closer until he could count the mother's breaths, thin and guarded. She watched without blinking. He let the moment stretch so she could decide whether hope had any place left. In that small space, the stakes were clarified. The mother would not leave. The pup could not endure much longer. The fence would not forgive mistakes. Caleb accepted all of it without asking for fairness. He had come to the woods to quiet old battles, and found a new one arranged at his feet. He pinched the handkerchief between two fingers, prepared a plan that depended on steadiness, and committed to seeing it through. Later he would name the mother Mira, and the pup Ember. For now he focused on making survival possible. Caleb lowered himself until his knees brushed wet needles and his weight settled into a patient crouch. He kept his shoulders square and his breath even, letting steadiness speak before words. The German shepherd's stance stayed hard, yet fatigue trembled through the muscle. He saw marks around her neck, pale bands where rough hardware had rubbed skin raw, old collar scars. Distrust made sense. He matched that truth with a tone shaped for uneasy souls. Easy, girl, he murmured. I'm not here to take him. He placed the sentence in the air and left space around it so meaning could arrive without pressure. No reaching. No grabbing. Hands open, palms visible, fingers loose. Leather gloves still hugged his wrist. He slid them off and tucked them under his knee, skin bare now. A surrender animals notice. Mira's growl rolled beneath the fog low. She planted a hand over Ember, guarding the tiny chest as if will alone could keep breath. Mist cloaked the pines and softened edges until the clearing felt like a room formed from cloud. He considered the phone in his pocket and did not move. Bars came and went on the ridge. Down here the signal sulked behind rock and spruce. Calling would mean backing away, climbing, leaving a mother alone with a trap that ate skin with every twitch. His gut told him she would try to follow if he turned. Fear would shove her into the wire. The pup would pay. So he stayed, swallowing urgency, choosing patience over speed. Memory reached across years like mist across bark. A flight line at dawn. Rios, laughing. Then a team pinned behind a wall, turning to powder with every hit. He remembered dragging that friend by the vest while dust-coated teeth, promising an extraction that never came. Loss leaves grooves you keep tripping over. Mira's defiance felt familiar. A stance he had worn. Listen, he said, spacing syllables so tension could breathe. We'll fix this together. He set his jacket near the fence, close enough to grab when the moment opened. The pup quivered, then went still. Caleb adjusted by an inch. He angled his body sideways, smaller, a profile without threat. He angled his eyes aside, avoiding the stare predators use. A breeze slithered across trunks and threaded needles into whisper. In that hush, every tick mattered. The tremor along Mira's foreleg, the faint rasp inside Ember's throat, the slow cadence of lungs trained to keep tempo when chaos tries to steal it. He saw where the twist held the paw. Two rusty barbs pinched skin between a loop and a bent tine. The pup's position made force dangerous. The wire needed opening rather than pulling. He scanned the ground for a straight stick with leverage. A sapling lay broken a yard to the left. Reaching would cross the line Mira guarded. He waited, letting the possibility sit until she could read it on his face. The growl shifted, still warning, but thinner at the edges. Her amber eyes flicked from his hands to the stick and back. He answered with a tiny nod that asked for permission without assuming it existed. He swallowed, felt the scar in his leg tighten, and pressed his palm to the earth to anchor calm through contact. It's all right, he whispered. I'll stay where you can see me. He made that one slow reach, careful enough to make slowness almost invisible. Fingers closed on the stick. Mira's lips lifted then settled. He held the branch low and used it to sketch the path he planned, never crossing between her and Ember. He wanted her to see that the road to help did not require betrayal. She did not blink. He took that as acceptance of the process, not of the result. Have you ever seen trust built from pain? Share your thoughts in the comments. The thought lived in his mind even as he kept focus on the lives in front of him. He planted the stick's tip beside the twist and tested resistance. The fence creaked. Ember Mira huffed and reset her feet so her body still covered everything that mattered. He paused again. In another life he might have forced the hinge, taken the bite and dealt with fallout later. War teaches blunt answers. Age teaches caution. He breathed in, breathed out, then turned the stick just enough to open a sliver. Metal rasped. The gap widened a hair. He slid the handkerchief through that space and wrapped it around the barbs, padding sharpness with cloth. The motion stayed small, predictable. Mira's growl softened from threat to warning, from warning to worry. The change was faint and yet felt like a door unlatched in the fog. Her eyes never left him. He kept his gaze soft, his shoulders down and his hands where she could track them. Trust is built from small proof. He offered the ones he had. A new breeze curled through, colder now. He shifted one knee and felt needles bite through denim. The stick trembled under force. Old metal complained. He rotated again, slower, waiting each time until Mira accepted the state before asking for a change. He pictured Rios and let the memory steady his hands. Good, he told Mira when she held position. You're doing well. She released a breath that fogged the air between them. Her paws flexed. Tension bled from her spine by degree. The loop eased enough for him to slip 2 fingers between cloth and iron. Ember whimpered, a thin ribbon of sound that landed like a flare. I know, Caleb said, low, almost. He drew the handkerchief tighter, then levered the stick again. The barb lifted off skin. He did not pull the pup free yet. He let the opening exist while the mother recorded that nothing bad followed. He set the stick beside his boot, open palm facing her so she could veto the next motion. The forest held its breath with them. Mist clung to bark in beaded chain. Water tapped somewhere unseen. He slid one hand under the wire, palm up, fingers curled so nails would not snag. Mira's ears tipped forward. The growl faded to a faint vibration that felt more like pleading than a threat. "I'm going to lift," he said, "just a little." He lifted. The wire rose against cloth, not skin. Ember's paw slipped clear with a sticky sound. Blood beaded but did not spurt. He withdrew his hand as soon as the release was completed, keeping the space open while mother and child decided what this meant. Mira looked down, then back up at him. Her head dipped once, the smallest concession a guardian can give without surrendering duty. Caleb slid his jacket closer and formed it into a warm bowl near Ember's side. The pup's sides fluttered, tiny toes flexed. The mother nosed her baby into the fabric, then pressed her body around that bundle and settled. For the first time since he found them, her growl disappeared into quiet. He did not reach out to touch either of them, not yet. Trust had opened a door only enough for air and promise. He let the moment stand, breathed it into his bones, and prepared for the next careful step. A thin window of calm opened after the wire released Ember's paw. Caleb kept low, hands visible, jacket cupped around the little body like a hearth. Mira curled her ribs around the pup, and watched him with the grave focus of a sentry who had not slept in days. The growl drained to a hum, more worry than threat, yet tension lived in her shoulders. He let the quiet settle, then angled his phone toward a notch where he'd once found a fickle bar. One dot flickered. He tapped a preset text. "Need field help. Canine mother pup. Fence injury. North spur past the alders." The message slipped out before the signal vanished again. He would not leave them. The call would have to find its way through trees and weather. Minutes bled through mist. Ember shivered inside the folded jacket. Mira's breathing stayed clipped. Caleb spoke in fragments. "Good girl. Staying safe." He laid the handkerchief near the pup's paw, ready to wrap when fear allowed touch, and checked the fence again to be sure no barb would bite if panic surged. An engine threaded the trees as softly as a sewing machine. Tires crackled on a logging spur. A door clicked. Footfalls approached with a rhythm that carried purpose without haste. "Caleb?" a woman called, voice steady, pitched low so it would not ricochet. "It's Sarah Vance." He answered without raising his voice. "Here, 20 yards past the alders. Move slow." Dr. Sarah Vance slipped through underbrush in a pea-green field jacket scuffed at the elbows, dark hair in a brisk knot, canvas satchel across her chest. She knelt at a respectful distance and let her hands rest on her knees, palms down. Her face held that careful calm of someone who has watched midnight stretch toward outcomes nobody wanted and kept working anyway. Mira's hum thickened into a growl, lips lifted enough to redraw the line. Sarah adjusted by inches and rested her gaze on Ember instead of the mother's eyes. "Okay, sweetheart," she murmured to the pup. "You hang on." Caleb filled the space with context that the dog could accept. "She's been guarding him." The wire caught the paw. I opened a gap and patted it. "No deep lead yet. She tolerates me if I move slowly." Sarah nodded, proving pace rather than heroics. "Respirations? Shallow. Irregular. He chills fast." "Shock worries me," she said in a near whisper. "We need warmth, fluids, assessment, but first we keep the mother convinced we are not a threat." Compassion sharpened her features, then smoothed. "My husband and son were in a wreck on 84 6 winters back," she added softly. "People stopped. It didn't change the end, but I remember they tried." Mira watched Sarah's mouth, then returned to Caleb. The growl eased a fraction. Story can be a bridge, Caleb thought, even across species. He lifted the jacket corner so Sarah could see Ember's color. "We move when she lets us," he said. "If we push, she'll wedge herself into the wire again." Sarah opened her bag with deliberate quiet. Gauze, saline, thermal blanket, soft loop muzzle folded flat, syringes still capped, a thumb-sized pulse oximeter. Each item appeared and rested in a tidy line. She did not reach toward Mira, letting the mother record the shapes. "Your plan, earn permission." 3 steps, wrap the paw, raise the wire, and slide the jacket under as a sled, then retreat at her pace. "If the pup crashes while we negotiate, he may not come back," she warned. "He's on the edge, Caleb. We need a vein or at least warmed fluids in." She glanced at the thickening cloud bank. "Cold is closing. Mira's legs trembled. Pain flashed across her eyes, but her stance held. She pressed closer to Ember. Caleb recognized the equation. Time, trust, consequence, and another memory flared. A courtyard vanishing in dust while he carried a wounded soldier and counted the beats between bursts. The only path across had been steadiness tied to timing. He brought that lesson. No forced grab, he said. I've seen what panic buys. What would you do to save someone who doesn't trust you? Let us know below. Sarah set the thermal blanket near the jacket. Use this once she accepts touch, she said. Start at the core, not the paw. She slid a roll of gauze closer. Let me talk while you handle the wire. My voice keeps a clinic full of twitchy shadows steady most days. I'll mirror your pitch. He placed one palm flat, showed the move, then lifted the wire a fraction with the padded section still in place. Mira's eyes darted, then settled. Good girl, he told her. Sarah matched him with a murmur like water over stones. You're protecting him, we see. Ember whimpered, thin but present. Sarah watched the chest and spoke without insistence. Breathe, little Ember, she said, landing on the name that would follow him. Spark stay. Caleb wrapped the paw with the handkerchief as a buffer, then added 2 slow turns of gauze, each pass readable before it touched. Mira sniffed the cloth, huffed and kept still. Cold pressed through fabric while sweat trickled under his collar. The scar in his leg pulled as he shifted. He ignored it. Sarah warmed a corner of the blanket in her hands so the first contact would not shock. May I? She asked Caleb, then let the question drift toward Mira. The mother's ears tipped. Her mouth closed over the growl and left only Sarah slid the warmed corner under Ember's belly and tucked another fold over ribs. The tremor eased a notch. We try a lift now, Caleb said. He raised the wire 2 more inches and slid the jacket farther underneath until it became a bed. On your count. Sarah read Mira's posture. Panic no longer owned the space. Now, she said. Together they eased the tiny body onto the jacket, kept the blanket snug, and lowered the wire onto padded cloth so no barb-kissed skin. Mira moved in lockstep, her shoulder brushing Caleb's knuckle. He didn't flinch, accepting the contact as part of the pact forming here. The mother's strength faltered. Her legs shook so hard her chest dipped. She braced herself against Ember and looked up at Caleb. Ember eyes wet with something beyond fear. Pleading, yes, and command. Do right by him. Sarah shifted to logistics. Can you carry the pup while staying beside her? She asked. I'll take the bag. We keep the triangle intact. Mother, pup, you. Done. Caleb slid his hands under the jacket, making sure the fabric held shape. We'll move 10 feet. Pause. Let her check. Then go again. If she balks, we stop. He rose in a smooth line that did not jar the bundle and stepped back along the path he had crushed earlier, widening it so a limping dog could pass. They advanced like a careful tide. 10 feet. Pause. Mira inspected, breathed on Ember's nose, then touched Caleb's wrist with her muzzle, a notice rather than a nudge. 10 more. The forest accepted their procession. Mist blunting sightlines. Sarah kept up a ribbon of calm talk. Case notes turned lullaby. You're safe, she told me. We honor your watch, she added, steady as breath, while the forest listened and waited. Cold mist clung to the pines while afternoon light thinned into pewter bands. Caleb weighed options and chose the hardest path, carry Ember to shelter and trust Mira to follow. He lifted the tiny body wrapped in his jacket and blanket, felt the shallow rise against his forearm and set a patient cadence through the undergrowth. Mira limped at his knee, ribs trembling, amber eyes welded to her pup as if a thin wire tied their hearts. He spoke without command, promising only presence, then moved steadily between trunks beaded with water. Needles slick with moisture slid under his boots. Roots crouched like knuckles, testing balance. Every dozen paces he paused so the mother could inspect the bundle, touch a damp nose and reclaim duty. She would not surrender the watch. When pain seized her leg, she halted, gathered breath and pushed forward again. Branches shook beads that dotted his sleeves. Resin, iron, and the first metallic hint of snow hung in the air. Ahead, a creek stitched itself through stone with a metronome beat, counting time they did not have. The fence fell behind them and fog pressed closer until the world shrank to a procession of care. Man, bundle, mother, mist. Caleb mapped distance with practiced eyes, switchback, deadfall, granite lip, alder notch, then the service spur. Warmth leaks quickly from small bodies, trust leaks quicker from bruised soul. He turned his shoulders to present a narrow profile, kept his voice low, and never blocked the mother's line to the bundle. Patterns speak. He gave her one she could read. They angled over moss that drank sound and climbed a short rise where birch bark peeled like quiet fire. Mist thickened until trunks became pale ghosts. Ember stirred inside the folds, a flutter more felt than heard. Caleb whispered encouragement he would have denied himself during darker chapters. Mira listened, read tone, and eased nearer until her shoulder brushed his calf, as if proximity alone could steady a world that had learned to tilt. The service spur appeared as twin ruts holding puddled mirrors. A crooked mailbox leaned near a fir stump, its red flag long gone. Beyond, the cabin waited, a squared shape of old cedar and patience. He had planned those boards on nights when memory rattled windows harder than wind. He set the hearth in the center not for charm but because flame at the heart steadies rooms the way rhythm steadies lungs. Tonight, that choice mattered. They crossed the small yard, gravel clicked. Mira scanned every angle, muscles taut, wary of traps shaped by hands. She hesitated at the bottom step, nails scraping wood. The open door seemed to widen without moving. Fear and hope met on the sill and argued with equal vigor. Caleb set the jacket bundle just inside where a river of warmth breathed outward, then withdrew so the mother could choose. "You decide," he said. "No one closes you in." Inside smelled of cedar, ash, wool, coffee, and the faint ghost of a shepherd long gone. Mira sniffed, looked back at the trees, then toward the flames snapping behind the screen. Duty tipped the scale. She limped across and settled beside the bundle, arranging her body between unknown walls and non-love. Caleb laid the jacket on a folded quilt near the hearth, close enough to catch heat without risking singe. He fed kindling, coaxed a steady flame, then stacked split fur in a patient cross. Light layered the room in warm ripples chasing gray from corners. He filled a low bowl with water, set another with soft food, and slid both within reach. Mira ignored everything except the rise and fall under the blanket. Amber eyes tracked the tiny chest, not the stew of smells or the welcoming crackle. He washed his hands, then cleaned Ember's paw with saline, lifting gauze only when Mira's gaze permitted it. The wound oozed, not pumping, which offered sober hope. He dabbed, pressed, secured a fresh wrap, and tucked blanket edges around the small torso. Breath steadied into a thread that might hold if guarded by warmth, time, and patience. A kettle began its small song outside. Fog drew its curtain across the clearing, draping shed, woodpile, and truck. Icicles fattened along the eaves. Inside, fire painted Mira's coat with copper. She did not blink unless Ember stirred. A long exhale left her chest, relief chasing pain by inches, never daring to outrun. He watched that unwavering vigil and felt memory move beneath his ribs. Rotor wash, a courtyard bleaching at noon, grit between molars, a body getting heavier with each step, the taste of metal when a promise stretched past truth. He had carried weight for many miles and buried more names than he would ever speak aloud. Scar tissue taught economy: save what can be saved, hold steady, pay attention, make each motion count. Those rules fit tonight, they always have, uniform or no uniform. He brewed tea because ritual steadies hands. A little honey swirled in a shallow dish might coax cautious licks later. He edged the water bowl closer, then retreated to the rug to remain visible without pressing. Shadows climbed the walls like a tide. The old clock over the shelf clicked softly. Ember's breaths lengthened, still slight yet steadier. Mira allowed one sip, then returned to her post, ignoring food with a discipline any soldier would recognize. Ever felt torn between fear and hope? Share your story in the comments. The line drifted through his thoughts, the way mist drifts through timber, touching everything without pushing anything. He recognized that split inside his own chest. The guardian embodied it with every careful breath, every refusal to eat, every glance that measured exits while protecting life. He folded a wool blanket and set it near her paws, an offer rather than an order. She sniffed, evaluated, then rested her chin on the edge. He took that as permission to feed the stove and draw heat deeper into the room until chill surrendered the front space. A finger's width of open window kept the air lively. Flame answered with a contented hum. The cabin became a pocket of weather he could control. He called the clinic, left a brief status for Sarah, and placed the phone face down so the glow would not spook nerves wired for Ember. He checked Ember again, timing breaths with the second hand. The Count pleased him enough to let his shoulders unclench a notch. He spoke to Mira in the same voice he had used for skittish recruits who arrived tough and tired. "He's holding," he said. "You held him first." Returning to the hearth, he lowered beside her and studied the tiny face. Whiskers glistened. Paws twitched in exhausted dreams. He laid a palm on the floor where her muzzle could find it if reassurance felt necessary. She looked at that hand, then at him. Under fear lived recognition. This human was doing exactly what he said he would do. Thoughts ranged across the years since discharge, nights lined with ghosts, mornings stitched together by chores, a shepherd who used to sleep against the stove, the day that dog failed, the hollow it left, the way silence thickens after loss. He let those strands braid into a vow sturdy enough to hold. He would keep these lives safe, teach boundaries gently, rebuild weight until muscle filled out, guard the bond that had crossed a fence and chosen a home. He would not abandon guardians who had already been abandoned. He added another split and watched the flame lean. Ember sighed. Mira closed her eyes for one beat longer than earlier, then opened them again to continue the watch. Trust had not arrived, permission had. It would do for outside. Winter rehearsed, practicing the long breath it would hold for months. Inside, warmth gathered in the grain of the table, the curve of a mug, the metal of the stove. The cabin felt less like a box and more like a promise. Caleb matched the room's rhythm, breathing with it, not above it. He did not plan speeches or miracles. He planned small, repeatable acts that add up to a rescue. He shifted to the rug and leaned against the couch, boots set aside to keep mud off wool. Mira tracked the movement, then settled when nothing else changed. He placed the shallow dish within reach and looked away so she could accept without feeling watched. A tentative lap sounded, quick, cautious, grateful. Another sip followed. She returned to the Caleb smiled without showing teeth, then closed his eyes and listened to fire, wind and breathing. The house no longer echoed. It held. He let that realization soak into his bones the way heat soaks into bark. Night pressed its forehead to the wind. Inside, a promise gathered weight, quiet as breath, strong as oath, and he silently swore to keep it. Days settled into a steady pattern. The cabin seemed to remember. Cedar perfumed the rooms, smoke curled above a loyal flame, and warmth stitched gentle bands across the floorboards. Caleb rose early, fed the stove, refreshed water, and checked the neat wrap on Ember's paw. The pup's breathing no longer scraped the quiet. It carried a thin, promising rhythm. Mira curved herself around him like a living guardrail, ears pricking at every draft, gaze sweeping door, window, hearth and man. She allowed his routine without yielding her watch. He measured meals into small victories, broth cooled to comfort, flakes of poached chicken, softened grains. Ember sniffed, tasted, paused, then tried again with solemn effort. A tiny sneeze startled him. He glared at his own nose, then resumed. Mira acknowledged progress with one deliberate blink. Caleb praised in a low register made for skittish hearts and stepped away so pride could grow without pressure. Chores taught patience. He washed blankets, carried them to the porch rail and let a shy sun pull damp toward the sky. Mira stood with front paws on the threshold and back paws planted inside, unwilling to compromise her line of defense. When a truck muttered along the far road, she stiffened, watched and settled only after the sound thinned to nothing. Guarding remained instinct, though the sharpness dulled from razor to well-kept blade. Late morning brought a knock like a considerate question. Elena Ruiz, the teacher from down the lane, waited with a bottle tucked beneath her coat and a tiny dropper in a pouch. Kindness lived in her posture. She kept her body turned slightly, leaving a clean line between mother and pup. "I brought milk for the little spark," she said, tone warm and modest. Mira tensed, amber eyes bright, but she didn't advance. Caleb warmed a spoonful over steam, set it near the blanket, and let Ember decide. He lapped clumsily, silver mustache shining, then worked the trick again with new confidence. Elena crouched without intruding and told a quiet story about winter rabbits and brave hearts learning to trust. Rhythm softened the room. When milk pooled into a steady effort, she stood with the same care she had used arriving. "Call if you need more," she said, leaving permission on the table with the bottle. Night kept different weather. Memories arrived with boots on, tracking grit across sleep, a courtyard, a wounded friend, rotors beating a promise that never quite landed. Caleb woke with a damp shirt and quick breath, then matched his inhale to the stove's patient pull until heat steadied blood. From the rug Mira watched. Suspicion no longer owned her gaze, curiosity stood nearer. She drank, approached within arm's length, and held the space like a sentry who understands companionship can be part of guard duty. He didn't reach. She didn't flinch. That was enough. By the third sunrise, Ember explored beyond the blanket in wobbly arcs. He marched toward Caleb's old boots, pressed his nose to a scuffed toe, sneezed at the oil smell and attempted a dignified retreat that became a tumble. Caleb laughed softly and rolled a knuckle along the boards, so mirth stayed gentle. Mira tracked their exchange, testing whether lightness could coexist with vigilance. The answer pleased her, her shoulders eased by a breath. The cabin wore comfort like a well-used jacket. Cedar panels warmed, wool glowed, ironwork hummed with the stove. A small photograph of a shepherd long gone stood on the mantel. Caleb slid it slightly so new eyes wouldn't feel challenged by an old stare. Mira studied it once, decided Brahmi could share the room, and returned to watching Ember, who had discovered the thrilling battle of rug fringe and was losing with enthusiasm. Ritual grew. Caleb swept the porch, traded ash for fresh logs, and dropped the cruel barbs he had cut from the rusted fence into a bucket like captured trouble. Mira sniffed the pile, looked at him, and relaxed in a way veterans recognize someone had walked the perimeter. Elena returned most afternoons with another bottle and sometimes a thin book. She read in a steady classroom cadence while Ember worked the dropper, and her voice turned the room into a smaller, safer world where hunger made sense and endings did too. Under the cloud, the yard hushed. Snow tested the rail, melted, tried again. Ember chased a flake that slipped through the door crack and discovered that weather can vanish when kissed. Mira's tail moved once, then again. Caleb pretended not to notice. Some joys grow wild when ignored. He sewed a thicker pad for the basket by the stove, lined it with old flannel that smelled of pine soap, and watched the pup claim it with triumphant seriousness. Sleep still frayed at the edge. Some nights he sat on the rug with his back to the couch, letting heat loosen knots that discipline never could. When thunder from old days rolled through thought, he counted with the draft until the storm fell behind the present. One of those hours Mira left the hearth and stood near his shoulder, not touching, simply occupying the space so leaning stayed an option. He didn't, knowing he could prove his own medicine. On the fifth day, Elena arrived with a bell on a rib. "If he learns to tap, you'll know he's thirsty," she suggested, offering possibility rather than orders. Caleb looped it on a chair leg. Ember batted at it, startled at the chime, then tried again with deliberate curiosity. The bell rang twice that evening. Milk appeared twice. Trust sounded like a tune nobody wanted to end. Mira approved the arrangement, inspected the saucer and returned to her post with easier breath. Small firsts kept time. Ember pressed his nose into Caleb's palm and didn't flinch. Mira allowed a hand to hover near her shoulder for a slow count, then accepted a single stroke along fur that had known harder contact. The kettle's hiss no longer pulled her to full alert. When the county truck rattled the distant road, she looked up, weighed the risk and chose to stay. Caleb stored these victories in a quiet ledger only he would ever read. He noticed more than improvement. He noticed how light rested on Mira's coat, how flame painted copper along her ribs, how her eyes softened when Ember collided with her belly and bounced backward in comic defiance. He noticed that she slept with her chin on his boot once, just once, and then not again, as if confirming a theory about safety and moving on. He noticed his own shoulders settling sooner after each startle, as if the room itself argued kindly with old train. Evenings gathered themselves and held. Elena's stories faded into the clink of cups. The stove breathed. The bell chimed now and then. Wind tested chinks and found them mended. Caleb checked bandages, cleaned bowls and sat on the floor so he and Mira shared a level. Ember explored his sleeve, growled a brave squeak and collapsed into a heap of ambition. The mother watched with grave humor known to anyone who has carried weight and then delights in wobbly courage. On the seventh morning frost lettered the yard in white script. Steam rose from the creek like a low veil. Caleb stood at the window with coffee cooling and counted blessings he would never utter. Behind him the room glowed, cedar, wool, iron, patience, breath. Mira lifted her head and met his eyes. Suspicion was gone, inquiry remained. She seemed to ask whether peace could last. He didn't promise, he prepared to keep proving it instead. Ember tottered to the old boots, sniffed and climbed a seam with the determination of a mountaineer. Mira breathed out a sound that was not a growl and not quite a sigh, something softer, almost curious. Across those days the cabin did more than shelter. It taught 3 battered lives a shared grammar: offer, wait, witness. Trust arrived not as lightning, but as a slow, steady burn that survives weather. When dusk deepened and the ridge turned blue, Caleb fed the fire. Mira tucked her nose over Ember's flank and the pup sighed a sound that belonged to belong. Silence followed, not empty but full, and in that fullness their scars felt less like maps of damage and more like proof that endurance can lead to gentleness. The call came just after sunrise when steam lifted from the creek and the stove ticked between breaths. Sarah's name glowed on Caleb's phone. He answered in a whisper because Ember slept with his nose tucked into Mira's ribs, and the room felt newly whole. Sarah spoke with steady compassion. She had pieced together reports from ranch hands, hikers and a county worker who serviced gates above Kelly Canyon. A loose cluster of abandoned dogs had been moving through the Bridger foothills for months, surviving on gut, deer scraps, spilled grain and luck. One female, large and black and tan, was often seen driving coyotes off feed piles, then melting into timber with smaller shadows trailing behind. "It fits," Sarah said. "Your girl likely led a shifting pack." Scar marks around her neck matched descriptions of cut collars. She probably learned to hold ground while everyone else slipped through. Caleb stared into the fire and pictured nights spent counting heads the way he once counted squad members. "That explains her watch," he said. "It explains the scars," Sarah answered, voice gentle. "Leadership born from abandonment leaves marks you can't see until you stand close." He thanked her, ended the call and turned toward the hearth. Ember stirred, tapped the little bell with clumsy certainty and wobbled to the saucer. Mira licked him clean, then walked to the door and stood listening beyond wood and weather. The posture returned again and again through the morning, a long study of the trees, a thin keening that slid under the threshold, like a silver thread, a return to the pup when he whimpered, another appeal to air as if calling names that might answer from snow. Elena arrived with a bottle and a teacher's reassuring smile. She watched the rhythm and pressed a hand to her chest. "She's calling," she said. "Some part of her still counts." Mira accepted milk for Ember yet kept scanning, nose lifted, ears pivoting for memories the wind might carry. After Elena left, the keening softened and somehow sharpened. Ember climbed Caleb's boot, peered at the door, then curled against his mother's ankle as if to weigh the present against the pull of the past and choose the warmth under her chest. By afternoon the ridge wore a blue edge and the air tasted of iron and wet leaf. Caleb tightened the pup's rep, shrugged into his field jacket and crouched at Mira's eye level. "Show me," he said. No leash, no command, only an invitation offered to an eat. She stepped into the yard, sampled the wind and turned her head up the spur. The trio set out, a man carrying a growing weight and measuring pace, a mother limping with a sentry's resolve, a child drowsy but curious beneath blankets that smelled faintly of cedar and ash. Mist draped birches and made each trunk a pale pillar. Needles released beads that clicked on sleeves. Snow flirted with the ruts, sketching a chalk seam then erasing it. Mira advanced at a careful clip, stopping to taste air rid tracks and decide. Twice she circled back to nose Ember's cheek before resuming the lead. When a jay scolded, she ignored the taunt. When a branch cracked, she waited and moved only after the quiet proved honest. They reached the broken fence as clouds folded low enough to brush treetops. The clearing held a hush shaped by memory rather than distance. Grass lay flattened in ovals where bodies had bedded during hard nights. Tracks braided the mud and faded toward a notch that opened on cattails and the creek. Iron scented everything: rust, damp metal, a faint thread of old blood. Caleb set Ember on his jacket within reach of the mother's chest and knelt, palms open, letting the ground have his weight. Mira stood square before the hazard that had bitten them, and stared at a single barb where a tuft of black guard hairs clung like a signature. She did not growl. She breathed, long and slow, and the sound carried more ceremony than warning. She touched the barb with the side of her muzzle and held there, honoring the place that had recorded her suffering without understanding it. Her flanks shook. Her eyes gleamed like amber lit from within by history nobody had bothered to witness. Sarah's words threaded through the mist. A pack had drifted along these cuts, following deer sleeping in windbreaks, sharing scraps when luck turned. Abandonment had pressed command onto the stubborn or the strong. Mira's scars told of both. Caleb recognized the stance. He had watched reluctant leaders take responsibility because nobody else would, then live with outcomes for years. He bowed his head until breath fogged the bar. "I see it," he said, voice low enough to honor the ground. Ember shifted on the jacket and pressed closer to Mira's leg, sensing sorrow without knowing the ledger that recorded it. He lifted his nose, found the metal scent and tucked himself beneath her chest, claiming shelter as birthright rather than gift. The gesture cracked something inside Caleb, a salt crystal he had carried under his sternum since the day Rios went still. Cold air dissolved it without permission. Mist braided around them and drew the fence into a wavering seam. Caleb examined the lower wire and found a tuft of lighter fur snagged under the twist, likely from a younger companion who had slid beneath. A bent staple testified to pressure exerted by bodies determined to pass anyway. He pictured nights when wind splayed the pines, when snow filled paw prints as quickly as they formed, when this dog stood here and chose watch over warmth, counting by breaths, because clocks fail when survival sets tempo. He crouched deeper until knees kissed wet needles and knuckles touched mud. Memory rose, dust thick as paste, a courtyard shrinking under fire, a wounded friend across his shoulders while rotors hunted a landing zone. Pain, duty and refusal fused into something he had never learned to name. That same alloy lived in the mother's frame. She was built from refusal. She was built from love. The combination looked familiar. Across the creek a crow called once, dry and spare, as if unwilling to decorate facts. Caleb answered by action. He took cutters from his pocket, wrapped the cruel barb with cloth, and clipped until the tooth fell harmless into his palm. He placed the shard in a canvas bucket with the other pieces he had removed earlier, and set the bucket on the jacket like a humble altar. Threats collected, edges blunted, vigilance kept. Mira watched each motion like an officer witnessing a play. Light leaked from the sky faster than footsteps could reclaim it. Ember mewed, exhausted by meaning he could not measure. Caleb lifted the pup against his chest, where the heartbeat could provide a steady drum. Mira pressed her shoulder to his boot, consenting to the new direction without abandoning the old ground. She looked once more at the fence, then forward as if informing the clearing that remembrance would ride with them while command traveled elsewhere. They walked home with fog closing ranks around their ankles. Wet grass brushed cuffs. The air tasted of pennies and snow. Ember exhaled small clouds into Caleb's collar and slept, trusting the rhythm under his ear. The mother limped beside them, guarding flanks against shadows that would always exist, a sentinel who had learned to add hope to her kit. When the cabin came into view, windows poured soft gold that turned mist into thin honey. On the porch, Caleb paused and looked back over the trail, knowing returns write a new layer atop older maps. "No more leaving," he said, forming the vow aloud for discipline as much as comfort. The room answered with warmth when the door opened. Inside, the stove caught fresh kindling and sang low. Mira entered first, eyes sweeping corners, then settled with Ember pressed to her chest and her head on Caleb's boot as if agreements need signature. Duty shifted from emergency to guardianship. That change mattered. He set the bucket of barbs beside the wood bin, visible and harmless, a record of blades removed. He laid the cutters on the mantel beside the small photograph of his first shepherd, and the folded flag that traveled home in a wooden triangle. Firelight touched metal and cloth, and made both glow the same color. He knelt again, meeting the amber gaze without flinching. "You have a pack now," he said. "It is smaller but it will not vanish." Mira closed her eyes for one long breath, opened them, and returned her attention to the sleeping pup. Caleb let the promise settle into the grain of the floor, and the cedar-scented air, and he vowed quiet, absolute, that neither dog would face abandonment again. Saturday's fundraiser filled the Bridger Rescue Center with color and cheerful noise rolling through bright corridors. Paw prints dotted teal walls. Banners fluttered above kennels in sunflower, coral, and lake blue. Volunteers kept coffee steaming beside a bone-shaped jar. Beyond the lobby, a fenced yard glimmered under a shy sun, paths edged with marigolds and a chalkboard reading, "Every rescue is a beginning." Caleb parked near the workshop, lifted Ember from his carrier and let Mira step down at her own pace. She sniffed the air, sorting unfamiliar scents, disinfectant, rubber mats, biscuits, damp fur, weekend rain and the faint metallic thread of chain link. Her posture stayed alert without bristling. Ember blinked at the bustle, then wriggled forward, eager to greet the day with a confident wobble earned over weeks. Elena met them at the gate, brown scarf tucked under her chin, kindness bright as ever. Beside her stood Lila, a shy 11-year-old in a moss-green hoodie, thumb hooked in a pocket, gaze mostly down. She pressed closer to Elena and peered through loose curls at the yard where dogs streaked after tennis balls and people called names with hopeful laughter. "Hey there," Elena said, keeping her voice and gestures gentle. "Crowd's big today." Caleb nodded. "We can linger along the edge." He lowered Ember onto the crushed stone and stayed crouched so the world didn't loom. Mira stood near his shoulder, tail low, eyes soft, measuring everything while giving space. Ember nosed forward with exploratory courage, only half remembering hardship. He sniffed a beagle, sidestepped a labradoodle skid, and planted himself at Lila's toes as if drawn by something he recognized. Quiet wrapped around bravery. Lila's chin lifted a notch. The pup wagged with a rhythm that seemed to say, "Pick me and I'll pick you back." She reached without quite touching, then curled fingers into her sleeve and waited. Ember scooted closer, set one paw on her shoe and sat, offering steady company. A sound escaped the girl like a bell buried under blankets. Hesitant, bright, surprised. Elena's breath caught. "That's a laugh," she whispered, eyes glossing because the tiny music hadn't visited often since court dates and sad Tuesdays. Lila covered her mouth, then uncovered it and tried the laugh again. Ember, delighted, spread his front legs and bowed. He yipped once, polite as a question, then sprang sideways in a small arc asking for play. Lila answered with the world's smallest skip. Mira watched the exchange, weight balanced, worry anchored by trust in the man beside her. Caleb brushed her shoulder, not as control, just a signal that said, "I'm here." She allowed the distance between herself and Ember to widen by 3 cautious strides. Her ears never stopped listening, yet the line of her back softened like thought. Around them, the center moved with gentle purpose, posters taped straight, bowls refilled, leashes looped, soft music weaving through chatter, smells braided together, cinnamon rolls, wet gravel, heater kerosene, printer ink and uncomplicated joy. Caleb breathed through memories that usually pressed hard during crowds. No alarms hid here, only celebration. His shoulders unlocked, a minor miracle disguised as posture. A volunteer offered a clipboard. "If you're comfortable, we can add Mira and Ember to the socialization board." "We'll go slow," Caleb said. "He's young. She's learning safety." Marker letters noted, Mira guardian energy and Ember sunbeam. The phrasing felt simple and true. Lila sat cross-legged on the stones, sleeves tugged over her head. Ember climbed into her lap as though that seat had been reserved by fate. She scratched a tiny arc behind one ear. He melted, a puddle with paws. Elena knelt nearby, tears she didn't hide brightening muddy light. "When has a small moment changed your life? Share below and inspire others." She said it softly, an invitation for viewers and a promise to the girl leaning into presence like sunlight after February. Caleb's attention drifted to Mira, greeting a calm shepherd mix through mesh. Tails signaled, noses touched, tension stayed low. He traced the lattice of healed skin around her neck, studying scars like topography. Each pale line recorded a season, a lesson, a refusal to yield. He saw his own history mapped there. Bullets, sand, stretchers, folded flags, folded mornings, long nights, turned shorter by chores and watchfulness. If scars had language, theirs would speak the same word, endure. A staffer brought a balance board for confidence work. Mira stepped on, hesitated, then found center with a soldier's competence. Ember performed a miniature version on a wobble disc, then sprinted back to Lila to brag by panting. Lila grinned fully this time. The sound of her delight traveled along chain link and reached an old spaniel which thumped its tail, joy rippling outward like a pond ring. Caleb noticed his breathing had matched the room's steady unfold. He watched Mira in profile, lit by winter sun, strong because of survival and not in spite of it. The dog turned and met his gaze, a look that held rank, gratitude and partnership. He bowed his head in acknowledgement, an exchange between guardians who shared the same oath. A small parade began, candidates for adoption clipped to bright leads, handlers moving at dog speed, families pausing to read plaque. Elena pointed out Lila's favorites, a one-eyed healer with impeccable manners, a cattle dog that preferred puzzles to fetch, a massive Pyrenees determined to lean against every person within reach. Lila giggled when Ember mimicked the lean against her shin, clownish and completely sincere. They toured the indoor agility loop. Mira took the tunnel slowly, then exited with a quick look for confirmation. Caleb praised with quiet certainty. Ember flopped halfway through, rolled and sneezed on the mat. Lila applauded. Staff cheered. Time moved politely. Afternoon light mellowed, carrying gold into hallways. The donation jar is filled. Volunteers snapped group photos under a garland spelling "Welcome Home." Mira allowed 3 strangers to scratch under her chin, while Ember posed like a practiced ham across Lila's knee. Caleb returned every touch with a thank you and watched for overload. None appeared. Safety had settled into bones. He stepped back near a mural of mountains painted by school kids and exhaled a breath he hadn't known he held. Reflection arrived, without theater. He saw a mother's scars turned silver by patience, a child discovering laughter under shelter lights, a puppy learning that hands can lift without taking. He saw himself inside that triangle, not outside. War had carved him, grief had thinned him, solitude had kept him upright, and now guardianship stitched him back together with thread he trusted. As the event wound down, Elena touched his arm. "You gave them steady ground," she said. "They're giving it back." "Feels mutual," he replied, eyes on Mira while Ember kissed Lila's knuckles solemnly, as if sealing paperwork invisible to adults. Mira glanced back once, then paced forward, calm and sure today. Caleb gathered Ember, clipped Mira's lead and thanked the staff. The sun dropped behind the ridge, leaving pink pages across the sky. Color lingered on the kennels, refusing to pack up with the table. They walked out through air tasting of cinnamon and damp stone, carrying more than they had arrived with, even though nothing new rode in arms, unless you count laughter, steadiness and vows quietly renewed. Spring settles over the Montana Valley in young green and warm gold, painting the foothills and the creek edges with fresh promise. Snow pulls back into high saddles where wind still keeps its sharpened teeth, but down here the air smells of thawed earth and sap. Meadow larks stitch music across the fence lines. The cabin no longer feels like a lonely lookout. It lives like a home for 3 hearts that learned patience the hard way and decided to keep it because peace needs practice. Cedar breathes in the walls, wool softens on the chairs, and the stove naps through mild afternoons while open windows invite lilac breeze and a faint thread of creek song. Mira moves with a steady grace, gait still marked by winter's wound yet carried with the proud dignity of a sentry off duty at last. Her eyes, once lit like warning lanterns, glow now like a campfire guiding late travelers to shelter. Twice each week she rides into town with Caleb for veteran circles beneath the Grange rafters. Steeled men and women sit in folding chairs and speak truths they rarely risk anywhere else. Some carry jagged roadsides inside their chests. Others hold deserts that stretch between interruptions of sleep. When Mira settles at their feet, shoulders loosen, jaws unclench and hands stop fidgeting because a guardian has decided the room is safe. Ember grows into his name the way mornings grow into sunlight. He wakes early, yawns grandly and launches across the day as if time itself were a meadow that needs running. He noses Lila's shoelaces, patrols the porch boards and greets swallows with earnest chirps that convince nobody but delight everybody. His paw, once bound in gauze, now taps the bell with a theatrical flourish whenever thirst or curiosity visits. Lila laughs each time, and the sound lands like bright coins in a jar no one can spend. Joy answers the silence that used to live here, and the house keeps that music the way old timber keeps summer heat. Lila visits whenever school frees her to the wide air. She walks the lane with Elena, kicks stones and brings small secrets only 11 can carry with such seriousness. Sometimes grief shadows her forehead. Then it steps back when Ember tumbles over her laces and refuses sorrow a proper seat. Together they invent games with bells, pine cones and perfect timing. Ember rings, bolts, vanishes beneath the porch, reappears triumphant and somersaults into laughter. Lila crowns him with clover that can't stay straight, and he wears it like a medal he intends to earn again tomorrow. Caleb repairs the fence line he once treated as an unkind boundary. He pulls rotten posts, sets cedar, stretches smooth wire and leaves wildlife gaps he can pull closed when calves wander. Wrenches sing a small metallic song, and sawdust freshens the yard. He keeps one rusted barb in a jar on the mantel, not as a threat but as a witness turned harmless. Next to it rests Ember's tiny bell, polished by paws. Between them sits a folded note, Lila printed in careful letters, "We made it." He never moves the paper. Some proofs deserve exactly the spot they first claimed. Routines knit days together. Morning patrols band the pasture with footprints, dew beads glittering like applause along every blade. Midday naps drift into soft snoring beneath windows where cotton curtains breathe like patient lungs. Evenings bring the gentlest rituals. Embers banked, bowls placed. The porch swept, stars counted until counting becomes prayer. When thunderheads explore the far ridge, the trio sits through the rumble with the calm that felt impossible last winter. Trust reduces echoes, love edits weather. Time turns hard edges into maps, and every line now points toward home. Spring runs long and generously. Wild flowers arrive by platoons, shooting stars, paintbrush, lupine, buttercup. Ember sneezes pollen and returns to play. He is sturdy now, built for laughter and for naps under hats left on the rail. Lila braids clover crowns and sets them on dog heads with ceremony, equal parts solemn and ridiculous. Mira wears hers like a matriarch, remembering rituals from valleys where wolves listened, moons watched, and families learned patience by imitation. Caleb photographs that coronation, not for posting but for proof that tenderness keeps better records than pain ever did. Neighbors learn their rhythm. Eggs appear on the stoop. The mail carrier scratches Mira through the gate and calls Ember his assistant supervisor. The Grange schedules another support circle and asks whether the shepherd will attend a graduation for peer mentor. Caleb agrees because quiet service suits them. Folding chairs surround a long table draped in butcher paper. Pens scatter for doodles. People draw rivers, bridges, ranger towers and open hands. Mira stretches across boots like a bridge of her own, and faces lengthened by heavy years shorten into ordinary human softness. On a rare hot day they follow the creek upstream along a narrow path where alder shadows pool like cool water over stone. Ember discovers the pleasure of paw-deep splashing. Lila skips rocks, counting skims, missing on purpose so a puppy can chase rings that fade into circles of sky. Caleb sits on a low boulder and watches Mira's reflection. For that once bristling lie's glossy eyes, that once measured threat now patrol the horizon only to admire it. He sees his outline beside hers, shoulders easier, breath steady. Certain aches persist, loss taught them. Acceptance lets those aches be true without letting them rule. Another afternoon brings them to the porch, framing their favorite view. Boards have been sanded smooth. A bench built from barnwood waits beneath the window. The meadow rolls away fresh as a prom. Cows graze along the tilting fence. Calves nap under willow shade. Swallows write swift cursive above workaday clouds. The sun begins to slide toward fields not yet bronze. Mira climbs the steps, pauses to check corners, then settles. Ember circles twice, curls into a comma against Caleb's boot, and sighs in the language of complete trust. Wind bends grass and combs the cottonwood, turning every leaf into a small mirror. Light breaks into coins and scatters them across the pasture. The mountains hold their patient silhouettes at the horizon like old friends who never rush the conversation. Caleb rests his hand along Mira's back and feels a sigh that belongs to a guardian who has set down some weight without dropping her watch. Ember dreams, paws twitching with invisible races. Far off a train climbs the pass, its horn fading in and out like a memory practiced until it grows kind. The porch keeps them gathered shoulder to shoulder, breath to breath. The sun finds the notch and pours honey over the valley. Colors layer themselves: apricot, rose, copper, violet. Scars that once announced injury resemble threads stitched by time, fingerprints of battles endured and of bonds chosen afterward. Mira lifts her muzzle and inhales cut grass, creek water, fresh wood, bread cooling inside, crayons from Lila's bag, and the bright tang of an evening promising fair weather. Ember wakes, blinks, leans into Lila, and looks at Caleb the way young ones look at anchors when tides change. Night edges close, bringing crickets' soft hoots and that confident hush which settles over places tended with care. Caleb watches the sky and thinks of friends who never got evenings like this. Then he honors them by living this one fully. He touches the jar holding the single barb, the bell beside it, the note declaring success and thanks a universe both unpredictable and generous. He believes now that redemption walks in small steps, pads into rooms on 4 feet, and sits quietly until you realize it intends to stay. They watch until the last glimmer dims behind the ridge. A cooling breeze crosses the porch and trades the long day for a gentle night. Caleb speaks for them all, voice even, eyes wet, heart steady. Words sure as the stars arriving one by one. This story shows miracles come quietly through trust, love and second chances. If it moved you, share it, subscribe and comment, amen, to spread hope. Let's honor every guardian and every spark of redemption together.